Well, hi, everyone. Happy Easter. I'm so glad that you're here. Thanks so much for spending part of your Easter day with us. The resurrection is important because death is our greatest enemy. Death was only a concept for me until I was practicing with the homecoming court. You know how the couples line up on the football field to be introduced at halftime? We were on the field practicing where to walk and where to stand. And suddenly my mom was there. Now, I saw my mom every day, but I saw my mom there at home. I never saw her here at school. Worlds were colliding. And Mom had come to tell me that her father had died a few hours earlier, and she wanted me to hear it from her in person. And until that moment, death had been a distant concern for me. I knew people died, obviously, but I had spent very little time contemplating death. You've heard the ominous phrase, matters of life and death. Well, I had been completely focused on matters of life. And death seemed irrelevant until it took someone I loved. And I know that has happened to nearly all of you. What happens to us when we die? Most of us have heard both secular and religious theories that seek to answer that question, but those perspectives are from people who have not yet died. And I know some people who were in cardiac arrest for several minutes. They have interesting things to say about their brush with death. But does anyone really know what we can expect when we die? A woman's best friend was moving her business to a new and better location. She was excited for her friend, so she ordered a huge bouquet of flowers for the grand opening. On the day of the event, she walked into her friend's place of business and she saw a giant bouquet of flowers. But she was very unhappy to see that the florist had delivered the wrong flowers. He had delivered flowers intended for a funeral. And on the flowers was a ribbon that read, "We're sorry for your loss." As soon as she left her friend's place of business, she called the florist and said, "The message on the flowers could not be more inappropriate." And the florist replied, "Well, actually, it could be. Somewhere there's a funeral with flowers that are labeled, 'Good luck in your new location.'" After we die, can we look forward to a new location? I know this is a tender topic for some of you. If you follow me on social media, you know my dad's 100th birthday was several weeks ago. He's been gone for decades, but I thought of him repeatedly as I wrote this message. This topic gets very personal very quickly. One of my best friends lost his mother a few weeks ago, and her birthday this year is today, Easter Sunday. This topic is very personal for him. For some of you, this is the first Easter without someone who is precious to you. So I promise I'm not stumbling into this topic without realizing how poignant it is and how fresh it is for some of you. Most of us are well beyond where I was in high school, and death is more than a concept for us now. It's become a painful reality, and it has brought with it some pressing questions. For some of us, what happens after we die has become the question that is on our minds, and in some ways it should be. But if we simply cease to exist when we pass, the question is moot, it's pointless. If there's no afterlife, no awareness, no judgment of evil, if there is no reunion with those who've gone before us, then we are only torturing ourselves with these questions. And if we simply cease to exist, the most worthless emotion in the world is hope, because there's nothing to look forward to. If there's no God, if there's no afterlife, evolution has really let us down by not eliminating the human impulse to hope. You know, most customs are confined to an ethnic group or a country or a continent, but there is an ancient Easter custom that has spread across the globe over time to nearly all believers in Jesus. It's a little like the Illini chant, where a leader chants I-L-L and the crowd responds I-N-I. The custom is that on Easter Day, a worship leader will proclaim Christ is risen, or Jesus Christ is risen, and believers will respond. Do you know the response? He is risen indeed. And friend, that last word could not be more important. You know, sometimes a person is unable to attend a function and that person will say, well, I'll be with you in spirit. And what does that mean? It means I will not be there. I'll be thinking of you. I wish I could attend. I've got a big pickleball game, but I will not be present at the thing. Indeed, I will be absent. Sometimes a person who is dying will comfort loved ones by saying, I'll be with you in spirit. But that is a gentle way of saying, I can no longer be with you indeed. I would stay if I could, but I can't. The word indeed means this is real. It's a fact. You can count on it. Well, our Easter confession is not, He is risen in spirit. It is not, He is risen, whatever you think risen means. Frankly, if that is all we can say, it's not much. We say He is risen indeed. So there is no confusion. We are testifying the resurrection of Jesus literally happened. Now, if that is a stretch for you, if you could not say you believe that, I am glad you are here. Whether you came today because someone asked you to attend and you, in a moment of weakness, said yes, or because your mom said this is required if you want the meal afterwards, or maybe this is a throwback to a time in your life when you believed things that you now seriously doubt, or even if you are here to inwardly disagree or even to mock what we believe, I suspect that God is using your reason for being here for His reasons. And to be honest, if you are struggling to believe, most of what I have included in this message today, I wrote with you in mind. And the scriptures that we're going to look at today, they were first written for people who share your doubts. Ironically, if you are not a believer, some of the Bible was written just for you, if you don't believe. Thoughtful people have had questions and doubts about the resurrection from the earliest days of Christianity. The first believers were the first doubters before they believed. And the resurrection accounts in the Bible are filled with skeptics. In the earliest churches, there were people who had trouble holding on to this belief that there will be a resurrection from the dead. Look at what Paul wrote to a church in the city of Corinth. Why are some of you saying there will be no resurrection of the dead? Now, these comments probably began with someone in the church who was comforting a grieving person by saying, take comfort, you're going to see your loved one again someday. But then someone else in the church replied, I can see why you'd want to believe that, but I think that's nonsense. Our bodies are not going to be raised from the dead. So someone in the church was telling a Christian friend, no one is going to rise from the dead. But the person saying it did not realize that he was undermining his own faith. So Paul explains this. If there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, all our preaching is useless and your faith is useless. Paul says, if you think you're a believer, but you don't believe in the resurrection from the dead, you're not a believer because that is what believers believe. And he goes on to explain that if Jesus did not come back from the dead, they were all still dead in their sins, they were unforgiven, and their loved ones who had died believing in Jesus, those people had no hope either. Look at verse 19. Paul writes, if our hope in Christ is only for this life, we are to be pitied more than anyone in the world. Have you ever heard someone say, well, even if what I believe turns out to be untrue, I'm still glad that I believed it? Paul said, not me. If I'm believing this stuff and it's not true, then someone should pity me. Look, not every unbeliever is sarcastic toward believers, but there are unbelievers who say, those poor, deluded Christians, they're so intellectually and emotionally weak that they have invented a religious idea that they actually believe is true. Well, Paul, who was also highly educated, said, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then the skeptics are right. If his resurrection did not happen indeed, those first century Roman Christians who were put to death in the Roman Colosseum, they were foolish for not recanting. They were foolish for not saying, okay, if you're going to kill me for this, I'm not going to hold on to it. And the early believers who were ostracized by their family and friends for saying they believed in Jesus, they were foolish also if it is not true. Paul says if Jesus did not walk out of his own grave, then the naysayers, they're right. But look at what he writes in verse 20. I want you to read these first three words out loud with me. Ready? But in fact, indeed, Christ has been raised from the dead. He is the first of a great harvest of those who have died. Can you hear the promise in those words? Resurrection from the dead is not limited to Jesus. It is for you too. There's another version that translates these words, but Christ has indeed been raised from the dead. If Paul had posted these words on Instagram or on Facebook, someone would have replied with a one-word comment, all caps, facts. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. It's a fact. In the original language, Paul puts the word indeed at the beginning of the sentence because in Greek, the word you put at the beginning of the sentence has even more emphasis. Indeed, Christ is risen from the dead. Now, I'm guessing it is exactly zero surprise to anyone in this room or online that the guy standing on the platform believes that Jesus rose from the dead. But I wrote today's message, and as I did, I tried to imagine the big questions that an unbeliever might have about what we believe and about what Paul wrote. And I'm sure there are many questions, but I thought of two key questions, and I'd like to try to answer those today. The first question is, why were there so many people in the first century who were convinced that Jesus rose from the dead? I mean, within weeks, there were thousands. Within months, there were tens of thousands. And many of us tend to think of ancient people 2,000 years ago, as being very superstitious. And we might conclude, well, they were just more susceptible to religious claims and mythology. They were gullible, we assume. So when a few people began saying Jesus rose from the dead, they bought in quickly because they were naive. But the reality is that when the news of Jesus rising from the dead was first shared, everyone who heard it was skeptical, including the people who had spent a lot of time with Jesus, including the people who had heard Jesus repeatedly predict that he would come back from the dead. On the Sunday after he was crucified, Jesus' mother and some other women went to the tomb to finish preparing the body for burial. The day before had been the Sabbath. They couldn't do it that day, so on Sunday morning, they were off to do it. But when they reached the tomb, they were met by an angel who said this, I know you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen from the dead, just as he said he would do. Come see where his body was lying. Now, they did not respond when the angel said this to them, oh, cool, that's exactly what we expected this morning. The verses that follow say they were excited, they were frightened. One version of the Bible says they were bewildered. This is not the response of someone who expected Jesus to be alive in spite of the fact that he said he would be. It is the response of someone who is having trouble harmonizing what they are seeing and hearing with what they expected. My father is buried in the state of Virginia. If the next time I visit my father's grave, I find it open, and there is an angelic-like being there telling me he is alive, this is exactly how I'm going to respond. I have to tell you, my initial response is going to be skepticism, confusion, excitement, bewilderment, the same thing these women were feeling. Because I've known a lot of people who have died and none of them have come back to life. But since the angel told these women to go inform Peter and the other men of what they had seen and heard, they rushed to share the news. And how did that go? Well, Luke tells us they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Wait, the men did not want to believe what the women were telling them? That's not realistic at all, is it? Now look, this is an important detail because if someone in the first century was going to manufacture a story of someone coming back from the dead, they would not have claimed that the first witnesses to see the empty grave would be women. Because in that culture, women could not testify in court in many cases. There is no first century liar who would make the women the first witnesses to the empty tomb. Only Jesus would do something that unexpected and that inclusive. And the only explanation for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John writing that the women were the first to see the empty tomb, the only explanation is that it happened that way. Now, all of this went down on Sunday morning. But that evening, that night, the disciples had still not figured it out. They were not out in the streets boldly saying, Jesus is back from the dead, he's back from the dead. No, John tells us they were in a room with a door locked because they were afraid they were going to be crucified next. And then this happens. Suddenly, Jesus was standing there among them. Peace be with you, he said. Look, if somebody I knew to be dead was suddenly standing next to me, talking to me, I would need peace with me. Then he said, as he spoke, he showed them the wounds in his hands and his side. It never occurred to me until I reread this a few days ago that the stone at Jesus' tomb was not moved so that he could get out. Because here, he materializes through walls, through a locked door that's bolted shut. He could have walked through the stone at the entrance of the tomb in the same way. The stone was moved so that the witnesses could go in, not so that Jesus could come out. But even after seeing the empty tomb, these disciples are still hiding behind locked doors. Why? Because they were skeptics up to this point. To use the phrase that Jesus sometimes used with them, they were slow to believe. And by the way, if you feel like you don't believe what other people believe as quickly, I just want you to see those are the kind of disciples Jesus recruits. Even if you're slow to believe, it doesn't mean he's not calling you to follow him. They were hiding because they did not yet believe Jesus was alive. So Jesus appeared and he showed them the spike wounds, the spear wound. And he wanted them to know that it was he. And by the way, the one disciple that was not with those guys that night, did he believe when all of his other friends said, Jesus appeared to us, he talked to us, he showed us the wounds from his crucifixion? Did that guy believe? No. He said, unless I see him, unless I touch his wounds for myself, I won't believe. So for 8 days, Thomas refused to believe their story until Jesus appeared to him and offered to let him touch his wounds. And Thomas said, I know it's you. You are my Lord and my God. And in John 20, Jesus said to Thomas, you believe because you've seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me. He was talking about us. Now look, I have to admit, I would have been hard to convince too. In my experience, everyone who has been moved into a cemetery is still there. So I am glad Thomas was hard to convince because his doubt makes my doubt easier to let go of. If he was hard to convince and yet he believed, then I can believe too. A pastor from Minnesota officiated a funeral that was some distance from the town in which he lived. And after the funeral, the hearse driver offered the pastor a ride back home, which often happens between funeral directors and ministers who are preaching at funerals. So as they drove, the minister became sleepy, so he made a joke, and then he lay down in the back of the hearse because there was no casket there. Now look, I'm not sure I could take a nap in a hearse. I don't know about you. But if I was really, really sleepy, maybe I could. When the driver stopped at a gas station, the minister woke up, and as he sat up in the back of a hearse, a man pumping gas nearby saw him sit up. And as far as we know, that guy is still running. Why was the man pumping gas so rattled? Because corpses do not reanimate. That is why Jesus appeared to individuals and appeared to groups. That is why he invited Thomas to touch his wounds. It is why he appeared to some people multiple times over several weeks. It is why Jesus appeared to one crowd of 500 people. I mean, that's a couple of sections from this room. 500 people at one time who all at the same time saw Jesus alive. 500 people don't see the same hallucination at the same time. And Jesus wanted those earliest believers to be confident in their faith. He didn't want them to think it was an idea. He didn't want them to think that he was alive in spirit or in theory. He wanted them to know he was alive indeed. And he did the same thing later with the Apostle Paul. While Paul was on a work trip to persecute people who were saying Jesus had come back from the dead, Jesus appeared to him and gave Paul no choice. Even though he had persecuted believers, gave him no choice but to say, Jesus is alive. And what difference did it make? This group of frightened disciples who were hiding behind doors, deflated, became a group of confident, courageous followers who put their lives on the line day after day, week after week, to tell other people that Jesus had come back from the dead. And this transformation in their behavior can only be explained by the fact that they did encounter Jesus who had come back from the dead, because he is risen indeed. And that begs the other question that I'd like to ask and answer. How does the resurrection of Jesus matter to me? How does it matter to you? I mean, if something phenomenal happens, that's one thing. But if it has implications for me, that is completely different. There is news, and there is news you can use. There is news, and there is news that changes your life. One author wrote, on Saturday, Christianity did not exist. On Sunday, it did. On Saturday, no one could have envisioned the church. On Sunday, no one could have stopped it. The resurrection not only means that Jesus was right, it means that you and I have a way of knowing that he was right. His claims, his moral teachings, his call to sacrifice our lives for him, his instruction that we are to seek his kingdom first, all of those words, all of those commands and expectations are valid because Jesus came back from the dead. So friend, today, I am calling you to believe in the resurrection of Jesus, not because I do, but because the overwhelming evidence of it and the unlikelihood that all of these skeptics that we read about in the Bible would become devoted believers if they had not seen him come back from the dead. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. And because of it, hope is not a useless emotion. You are not destined to live and die and to cease to exist. You have the hope of a new and better location. And the most important thing you and I do in this life is to prepare for the next. And the way we prepare for the next is to believe that Jesus came back from the dead and to stake our lives on it, just like his earliest followers did. Now, maybe you're asking, is it all just wishful thinking? I think that's a fair question. If I were an unbeliever listening to this message, I would be asking that question. Thomas Nagel is not a believer. He is an atheist philosopher and a retired professor. But Nagel admits that not only do Christians have some wishful thinking, but he admits that his atheism includes some wishful thinking. He wrote, I want atheism to be true, and I am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are believers. So if that's true, why doesn't Nagel believe? I can't answer for him, but I suspect it has something to do with the same thing that keeps many people today from believing. Because I think Nagel realizes that if you say you believe in Jesus, then your life should be transformed by believing in Jesus. And that can be a very inconvenient truth. Because to believe in Jesus means we should follow Jesus, and that is inconvenient. Now, is it wise to disbelieve just so we can pilot our own lives rather than surrendering to Jesus? It is not. A father asked his young children if they wanted to eat at McDonald's. You know what kids say when you ask them if they want to eat at McDonald's, right? Or if they wanted to trust him to choose an even better place for them to eat. And they said, well, Dad, what is the other place? And the father said, I will not tell you the name of the other place. You just have to decide whether you trust me or not to choose an even better place than McDonald's. Well, the kids knew they liked McDonald's, and they did not like the idea of some unknown restaurant. So they lobbied their dad for McDonald's. We want McDonald's. And their father never fully convinced them, but he kept the conversation going as he drove toward the place that he wanted to take them. And as they got close, he said, I tell you what, I'm going to decide where we eat today. We're not going to eat at McDonald's. We're going to eat at the place I'm thinking of. And even as they began whining about missing out on McDonald's, they noticed some shapes and some colors that were familiar as their dad drove onto the property at Disney World. And after they finished cheering, one of the kids said, I wish I had trusted you, Dad. And friend, all of us are going to say that when we stand before our Father in heaven. And Jesus Christ, who died for us and rose from the dead so that we would know we can trust him. Resurrection is a wonderful reality. But what challenges us is that the idea of resurrection includes death. You can't be raised to life unless you die. And Jesus never withheld this awkward truth from his followers. He said, following me is like taking up a cross every day. That is not the way you talk people into following you. But Jesus was honest. He said, there are many little deaths that you will die to yourself if you choose to follow me. And the Apostle Paul used this illustration. He said, when you put a seed into the ground, it doesn't grow into a plant unless it dies first. Paul was talking about the difficulty of us burying people that we love. He was talking about the difficult feelings we have about someday leaving this world, being buried ourselves. But he said, really, we're not being buried as much as we're being planted. Burial and planting look a lot alike. I mean, you cover something with soil. Circumstantially, they look like the same thing. But the results could not be more profoundly different. Because if something is buried, it stays under the ground. If something is planted, then something wonderful comes out of the ground. Your destiny is not to be buried. Your destiny through Jesus Christ is to be planted. You know, we all realize there's this uncomfortable weight after you plant a seed, right? And you wonder, is it ever going to come up? And it always takes longer for the plant to germinate than we wish. But the result is inevitable when something is planted. Speaking of planting, isn't it ironic that Jesus was buried in a garden? Isn't it ironic that Mary Magdalene thought he was the gardener when she first saw him that Sunday morning long ago? It's ironic that his enemies thought they were burying him for good. But the body of Jesus was only planted in that garden. What a difference resurrection power makes. That's why God commands all of us who believe to do what we saw someone do earlier, to get in water and to experience a mini burial and resurrection. Colossians 2 says, for you were buried with Christ when you were baptized, and with him you were raised to new life because you trusted the mighty power of God who raised Christ from the dead. That's resurrection power. And friend, resurrection power changes everything. Resurrection power is everything to anyone in this room who is facing a terminal illness. Resurrection power is everything to anyone who is old enough to realize that not following Jesus has taken a toll on your life. Oh, have I ruined my life? Not if you turn it over to Jesus Christ, because that's when his resurrection power becomes active in your life. It's everything because he is risen, not in theory, not in spirit. He is risen indeed. The question for you is, when you put your trust in Christ, his death and resurrection, what part of you will Jesus bring back to life first? I can't wait to see, and I hope you can't wait to experience it. Believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus and invite his resurrection power into your life.